Dumelang. In the last episode, I reflected on culture, on memory, on remembering, and what survives even after disruption. And I found myself returning to this idea of connectedness to ourselves, to one another, to those who came before us, connectedness to nature, to something larger than ourselves. And I sat with those reflections. Another thought kept returning. Many of us are living between worlds, between different ways of understanding life, different value systems, different expectations, different realities, and sometimes it can feel like those worlds are pulling us in different directions. As I reflected on culture in the last episode, I found myself thinking about something many Black Africans know intimately: the experience of carrying more than one worldview, more than one way of understanding reality, more than one way of making meaning. On the one hand, many of us inherit ways of understanding life that are rooted in community, in relationship, in interconnectedness, ancestry, nature, and a recognition that we are part of something larger than ourselves, right? On the other hand, many of us are educated within systems that emphasize individuality, achievement, rationality, productivity, competition, independence. And often these worlds are presented as though they cannot coexist, as though one must replace the other. Yet many of us carry both. I sometimes think that many Black children learn two languages of reality, not simply two spoken languages, but two ways of understanding life. At home, we may hear stories about our ancestors, community, family, respect, collective responsibility. And then we enter institutions that often speak a different language around, individual achievement, personal ambition, competition, self-sufficiency. Neither world is entirely right. Neither world is entirely wrong. But the movement between them can be exhausting and sometimes even confusing, sometimes enriching, and sometimes lonely. Because not everyone understands what it feels like to belong to multiple realities at once. And although I am speaking from a Black African experience, I think many people know this feeling. Immigrants know it. People who move between generations know it. People who move between social classes know it. People who carry multiple identities know it. The experience of standing with one foot in one world and another foot somewhere else. And sometimes it feels as though life asks us to choose. Choose traditional or modern. Choose African or Western. Community or individuality. Choose science or spirituality. Rationality or intuition. Choose past or future. And all of this is as though wisdom can only live in one place, as though one world must win and the other must lose. I think many of us have felt that kind of pressure to leave certain parts of ourselves behind in order to belong elsewhere, to become more modern, more professional, more successful, more legitimate, and perhaps sometimes we do gain things through that process. But I wonder, what do we lose? One of the questions I find myself returning to is this: what happens when a culture rooted in connectedness encounters a world increasingly organized around separation? Separation from nature, separation from community, separation from ancestry, separation from one another, and sometimes even separation from ourselves. We become consumers, workers, professionals, individuals, and all those identities matter. But what happens when they become the only identities we recognize? What happens when we forget that we belong to something larger, larger than our careers, larger than our achievements, larger than our individual stories? So I don't ask that as criticism. I ask it as curiosity. I am genuinely curious because I think many of us feel a longing we cannot quite name, a longing for connection, a longing for meaning, a longing for belonging. At the same time, I think it is important to acknowledge what modernity has given us. Technology, a particular kind of education, I suppose, a particular kind of access to knowledge, perhaps opportunities that previous generations could maybe only imagine. It would be easy to romanticize the past, but every era carries its own difficulties. Every era carries its own wisdom, and every era carries its own limitations. So this is not a conversation about rejecting modern life. I enjoy modern life. I enjoy electricity, indoor plumbing. I think most of us would agree these are positive developments. So the question is not, should we go backwards? I don't think we can. The question is, what have we gained and what might we have left behind? What have we forgotten? The older I get, the less interested I become in choosing sides. And the more interested I become in integration, in asking, what wisdom exists here, right now, and what wisdom existed then? What wisdom exists here now in modern knowledge? And what wisdom existed in or exists in our inherited knowledge? What wisdom exists in science, in culture, in tradition, in lived experience? And what might become possible if we allow these worlds to speak to one another, rather than forcing them into competition? Because perhaps wisdom does not always emerge from choosing one side, because wisdom emerges from holding complexity. This is what I've come to learn. Wisdom emerges from remaining curious, from learning, from listening. One of the interesting things about modern life is that we often place great trust in what can be measured, right? We trust what we can measure. We trust what can be proven or what can be counted. And yeah, those things matter. And they matter deeply. But human beings have always lived alongside things that cannot be measured, like love and grief and beauty and meaning. We can't measure, presence. We can't measure the experience of wonder or the experience of belonging and connection. Some of the most important aspects of human life refuse to fit neatly into a spreadsheet. And yet we know they matter. We feel their presence, we feel their absence. And perhaps this is where conversations about spirituality begin. Not necessarily religion, not necessarily certainty, not necessarily answers, but rather questions. Questions human beings have been asking for thousands of years. Questions about meaning, about purpose, about connection, belonging, life, death, mystery. Questions that seem to follow us wherever we go, regardless of how modern we become. Questions that survive every generation, questions that survive every culture, every technological advancement. Because no matter how sophisticated we become or we think we become, human beings still wonder. We still search, we still ask questions. We ask questions like, what does it all mean? What is the meaning of all of this? What is the meaning of life? Perhaps, living between worlds is not a problem to solve. Perhaps it is a reality to navigate. Learning how to honor where we come from while remaining open to where we are going. Learning how to remember while continuing to become. Learning how to carry multiple ways of knowing, multiple inheritances, multiple truths, and perhaps wisdom lives somewhere in that space, in all of that. Not in choosing one world over another, but in listening, in learning to listen to both worlds that may seem worlds apart. I want to stay with one thread, if I can call it that, a little longer. And that's the human search for meaning. Why is it that across cultures and throughout history, human beings continue reaching for something beyond themselves? That just does not seem to go away. We always search for meaning. All right, I will see you in the next episode. Lesedi Khanya.